In this video, we're going to take a look at multiplying and dividing integers. And before we start trying to multiply and divide two integers, I'd like to do a quick review of integers with you today. If I ask you the question, what is the opposite of 3? I would begin with a 3, and then I would take the opposite of it, which would end up being a negative 3. So the opposite of 3 would be a negative 3. So then one of your homework problems later on went to go ask, what is the opposite of 3? And if I were to take a look at that, I could say that beginning with a 3, once again, I could say the opposite of 3 would be a negative 3. But then if I take the opposite of that, I would add another negative sign. And I think in our homework and in class, we decided then that would equal 3. Because if we think about a number line, where I start with 0, if I start with the 3, the opposite of that would then become a negative 3, once again holding with the same colors as before. And then if I take the opposite of that, it's going to be back at 3. So this is going to be important when we start to think about multiplying and dividing integers. On this next slide, we're going to start considering two integers. Or a couple different cases. The first case is when I have 3 times 2. Now you might say to me, well, that's pretty obvious. 3 times 2 is going to equal 6. I've got two positive numbers. Let's go ahead and write this. Normally we'll write this as a positive times a positive is going to give us a positive number. Okay, so our positive times a positive equals positive. Okay, this is case number 1, which you hopefully have learned since about 3rd grade. Okay, but let's take this a step further. What's if I do 3 times a negative 2? I've changed the problem with the addition of this negative sign. And if I take a look at this problem, I can think about my rules with the opposites. 3 times the opposite of 2 will end up giving me a negative 6. The reason being is because I have one sign telling me to take the opposite. So when I say 3 times 2 is equal to positive 6, I can have the same 3, the same 2, get 6, but since it's times the opposite, I have to add that negative sign there. So what this tells us is that a positive times a negative would equal a negative number. Okay, once again, it operates just like you're used to with multiplication, it's just the sign that changes. So third case, negative 3 times a positive 2. Well, once again, I can say 3 times 2 is going to equal 6. But because it's saying the opposite of 3, this is going to end up being negative as well. Which tells us then a negative times a positive is equal to a negative. We can look at this then and say, well, these two scenarios both give us one negative, being with multiplication, and with that one negative here and here. Okay, the position of it doesn't matter, which would make sense because our multiplication property is commutative, which means that I can change the order without changing the value, okay, with multiplication and also with addition, okay? But since I've got that one negative, it's going to turn my answer negative. There's one last scenario which we have not covered, and that's what if both numbers being multiplied happen to be negative. So in the case of negative 3 times negative 2. Well, in this case, I've got a 6, But if I look at this negative, this would turn this negative, but then this negative would give me the opposite of 6, which we saw in the last slide, and hopefully you agreed with me, would equal a positive 6. So what this tells me is that basically a negative number times a negative number is going to equal a negative number. Equal a positive number. So a negative times a negative is positive. So summarized, if with multiplication, and actually the same rule is going to apply for division on our next slide, okay? If two numbers have the same sign, okay, in the case of positive, positive, or negative, negative, the answer is going to be a positive number. But if the two numbers have different signs, okay, and we're talking if it's positive and a negative or a negative and a positive, the order doesn't matter, our answer is going to be negative, okay? And I'm going to add this to include division as well. So it means if we start looking at a couple problems, if I give you 8 times a negative 3, my answer is going to be, hopefully you guessed it, negative from the one negative sign, and then 8 times 3 is going to be 24. Okay. 5 times negative 6 is going to equal, well, I've got two negative signs, so it's going to end up being a positive sign, and 30. Okay. And this positive sign I can write for emphasis, but usually, generally in math, we don't write the positive sign at all. Okay. Let's take a look at division. If I have 4 divided by negative 2, 4 divided by 2 is going to be 2. But since I've got this one negative sign or the one opposite sign, I've got to also change that sign as well. Another way of writing this would be to say 4 divided by negative 2. Remember the fraction bar is another way of writing division. Okay? What this would also tell me is if I have 4 divided by negative 2, this will also equal negative 4 divided by positive 2. In both cases, my answer is going to be negative 2. What this also shows us is that when we're writing a fraction, I'm going to put this over to the side for a second. When we are writing a fraction, say 1/2, I can think of that as 1 divided by 2. Okay? So if I want a negative 1 and I want to divide it by 2, okay, I can also write that as 1 divided by a negative 2. Okay, I still have one negative sign. And then a third way of writing that would be say it's negative 1/2. So there's actually 3 correct places to put a negative sign or an opposite sign. Okay. Once again, generally in math, you'll see the negative sign written here, but it's important to realize you can write it as the division of two integers like the second part, or you can write it like the first part. So you can put the negative with the number in the numerator or with the denominator. Okay, a couple problems to try on the next slide. And so here are 6 sample problems for you to try as we begin to look at multiplication and division. But I think the more you can remember that the same sign, you're going to end up with a positive answer, and different signs, you're going to end up with a negative number. Number 4 on this is a little bit of a challenge, but think about it a little bit, and I want to see if you can apply it, okay? And we'll check over these answers tomorrow, okay? Good luck. good luck, and hope you enjoy learning how to multiply and divide integers.